To understand the shock that awaited the German army in 1944, we first have to understand the silence that preceded it. For the first few years of World War II, the United States was a ghost. It was a distant giant, separated from the battlefields of Europe by the vast Atlantic Ocean and a wall of isolationist politics. For the average German soldier, the Landsur America was not a real place. It was a fantasy, caricature, a land defined not by its geography, but by its movies. Before the war, German cinemas were filled with Hollywood exports. The average German citizen didn't know Americans. They knew John Wayne and Al Capone. When a German soldier imagined an American, he pictured one of two things: a lawless cowboy riding through the desert, or a Chicago gangster spraying bullets from a Tommy gun. They saw a nation that was violent, yes, but fundamentally undisciplined. A cowboy doesn't march in step. A gangster doesn't salute. To the Prussian military mind, which had been drilled in precision and obedience for centuries, the Americans were a joke. They were viewed as a mob of individualists, incapable of the collective sacrifice required for modern war. But this ignorance wasn't accidental. It was carefully manufactured by the Nazi state. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, painted a picture of the United States that was contradictory but effective. On one hand, he portrayed America as a cultural wasteland. The Nazis sneered at American jazz, calling it Negro noise. They mocked American architecture, American food, and American manners. They told the German people that Americans had no soul, no history, and no culture, only a hunger for money. More sinister was the racial propaganda. Adolf Hitler viewed the United States as a mongrel nation. In the twisted ideology of the Third Reich, racial purity was the source of strength. Because America was a melting pot of immigrants, Germans, Italians, Irish, Jews, and African Americans, Hitler believed it was biologically incapable of producing a great army. He described the U.S. as a decayed country, rotting from the inside due to its diversity. He believed that when the shooting started, this mixed-race mob would turn on each other and collapse. This arrogance extended to the very top of the Wehrmacht. In 1940, the United States Army was tiny, smaller than the Army of Portugal. It used horses to pull artillery. The soldiers wore World War I helmets. When German generals looked at the statistics, they laughed. They saw a country of salesmen, not soldiers. Hitler famously dismissed the American industrial potential with a single biting sentence. The Americans know how to build refrigerators and razor blades, but they cannot build tanks. This belief trickled down to the trenches. In letters home, German soldiers expressed a strange mix of curiosity and contempt for the Amos. They didn't fear them. How could they? The German soldier had conquered Poland in a month, crushed France in 6 weeks, and was marching deep into Russia. They were the masters of the blitzkrieg. To them, the American soldier was soft. He was a soldier of comfort. The German press mocked the U.S. Army for providing its troops with chocolate, cigarettes, and chewing gum. They claimed that an American soldier would surrender if he missed a meal. They called the looming conflict a rich man's war, fought by people who would rather pay for victory than bleed for it. By late 1942, as the United States finally entered the war in force, the German attitude was one of supreme, dangerous overconfidence. They expected to face an army of amateurs. They expected cowboys who would shoot from the hip and run away when the going got tough. They expected gangsters who had no honor. The German soldier believed he was a professional warrior about to punish a nation of shopkeepers. He had no idea that the refrigerator builders were about to unleash a storm of steel that would bury the 1,000-year Reich. The propaganda had done its job too well. It had blinded them to the reality of the sleeping giant they had just poked awake. In late 1942, the phony war of propaganda ended. The cowboys finally landed. Operation Torch brought thousands of American troops onto the shores of North Africa. For the hardened veterans of the German Afrika Korps, this was the moment they had been waiting for. They had spent years fighting the British across the burning sands. Now they turned their binoculars toward the new arrivals. What they saw initially confirmed every joke told in the Berlin cabarets. The first major clash between the German army and the United States Army occurred at the Kasserine Pass in February 1943. It was not a battle. It was a humiliation. General Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, watched as his panzers sliced through the American lines like a hot knife through butter. To the German commanders, the Americans looked like a crowd, not an army. They made rookie mistakes that fatally exposed them. They positioned their troops on low ground, surrendering the heights to German artillery. They bunched their tanks together, making them easy targets for the terrifying German 88mm anti-tank guns. When the shooting started, panic set in. German field reports described American units disintegrating. Soldiers abandoned their positions. Officers lost control. To the disciplined German Lancer, who fought with cold, professional efficiency, the Americans seemed chaotic, soft, and terrifyingly inexperienced. One German officer wrote in his diary, "They are big and strong, but they do not know how to fight. They run when the mortars fall. They are amateurs with guns." For a brief moment, the Germans believed the war was won. They felt superior in every way. But as the smoke cleared over Kasserine Pass, the German soldiers began to examine the wreckage left behind by the retreating Americans. And that is when the laughter stopped. They found abandoned jeeps, sturdy, four-wheel drive vehicles that were vastly superior to the German Kübelwagens. They found trucks that were brand new, not worn out like their own. But most shockingly, they found the food. A German soldier, hungry and covered in dust, opened a captured American field ration. He didn't just find hard biscuits. He found tinned meat. He found instant coffee. He found chocolate bars. And he found cigarettes, packets and packets of them. In 1943, the German army was already starving for resources. They were siphoning gas from one tank to fill another. They were mixing sawdust into their bread. And here were the Americans, fleeing the battlefield, leaving behind a feast that looked like it came from a luxury hotel. Rommel himself picked up on this terrifying paradox. He realized that while the American soldier was green, the American machine was unstoppable. He famously noted the disparity. "The Americans," he observed, "fight like children, but they are equipped like gods." The Germans realized that these amateurs were driving into battle in vehicles that the German automotive industry couldn't dream of producing in such numbers. They saw that even a private in the U.S. Army was better fed and better clothed than a German officer. The victory at Kasserine Pass left a bitter aftertaste. Yes, the Germans had won the tactical fight. They had outsmarted the cowboys. But the intelligent German officers looked at the captured loot and realized the grim truth of logistics. They realized that the Americans could afford to lose. They could lose 100 tanks, 1,000 trucks, and 10,000 rifles, and replace them all by the next morning. Germany could not. The amateurs had been bloodied, yes. But the Germans noticed something else in the weeks that followed. The Americans learned fast. They fired the incompetent generals. They changed their tactics. They didn't break. The children were growing up quickly, and they were backed by an industrial assembly line that was just beginning to roar. The mockery in the German ranks began to fade, replaced by a creeping dread. They had defeated the vanguard, but they had seen the supply lines behind it. And for the first time, the German soldier understood that he wasn't just fighting an army. He was fighting an avalanche. By the summer of 1944, the laughter had stopped completely. The cowboys were no longer a joke. In Normandy, the German army learned a new word, a word that tasted like ash in their mouths. Materialschlacht, the battle of material. For the German soldier on the Western Front, the war ceased to be a test of skill or courage. It became a mathematical equation that they could not solve. It started with the sky. Veterans of the Eastern Front were used to fighting the Russians. It was brutal, freezing, and bloody, but the sky was often empty. In the West, the sky was American property. The German soldiers had a name for the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs that prowled over their heads. Jabos, short for Jag Bomber. The psychological terror of the Jabos cannot be overstated. A German panzer commander wrote home, "We move only at night. If we move by day, we die." They couldn't bring up supplies. They couldn't move reinforcements. They couldn't even use the latrine without risking a strafing run from an American pilot who seemed to have unlimited ammunition. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, had vanished. The joke in the German trenches went, if the plane is silver, it's American. If it's dark, it's British. If it's invisible, it's ours. But if the sky was terrifying, the ground was depressing. The Germans knew their tanks were better. A Tiger or a Panther could destroy a U.S. Sherman from 2 kilometers away. In a one-on-one duel, the German won every time. But there was no such thing as a one-on-one duel. A German tanker described the hopelessness. "I knock out a Sherman. I turn my turret, and there are 3 more. I destroy them. I look again, and there are 10 more. It was like fighting a Hydra." For every tank the Germans managed to drag from the factory, Detroit shipped 50 across the Atlantic. The German crews were exhausted, their machines were breaking down, and they were running out of gas. The Americans just kept coming, wave after endless wave of olive-drab steel. And then there was the artillery. The Germans prided themselves on precision. They fired sparingly, conserving shells. The Americans fired as if they owned the factory. German infantrymen were horrified by the wastefulness of American fire. If a German sniper fired a single shot from a church tower, the Americans wouldn't send a squad to clear it. They would simply level the entire church with a massive artillery barrage. They called it time on target, a technique where dozens of guns fired at once so that every shell landed at the exact same second. To the German soldier huddled in a foxhole, it felt like the apocalypse. One prisoner famously told his captors, "You Americans don't fight men. You fight map coordinates." But perhaps the moment that truly broke the German spirit wasn't a bomb or a tank. It was a chocolate cake. There is a famous story of a German unit overrunning an American position during the Battle of the Bulge. They were starving, cold, and low on ammunition. They raided the American supply trucks hoping for weapons. Instead, they found mailbags. Inside one package, sent from the U.S., was a fresh chocolate cake. It was still moist. The German soldiers stared at it in silence. They realized that while they were eating horse meat and stale bread, the American logistics system was so efficient, so overwhelming, that they could ship a fresh cake from a kitchen in Ohio to the front lines of Belgium in a week. That was the moment they knew the war was lost. They realized they weren't fighting an army. They were fighting an economy. They were fighting a supply chain that spanned the globe. The German soldier looked at his horse-drawn cart, then looked at the motorized American columns stretching to the horizon, and understood the crushing reality of material schlacht. Bravery didn't matter anymore. Tactics didn't matter. The Americans had simply bought more bullets than the Germans had men. The giant wasn't just awake. He was crushing them under the weight of his wallet. By late 1944, the German army had formed a clear psychological profile of their enemy. They had fought the British, who were methodical and cautious. They had fought the Russians, who were ferocious, reckless, and willing to die in the millions. But the Americans were different. To the German veteran who had survived the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, the American style of fighting was confusing, frustrating, and ultimately terrifyingly effective. They called it a rich man's war. The German military tradition was built on aggressive infantry tactics. The Wehrmacht was taught that the infantryman is the decisive element of battle. If you encounter a machine gun nest, you flank it, you storm it, you destroy it with grenades and grit. You pay in blood to take the ground. The American GI did not play by these rules. German officers noted with disdain that American infantry seemed risk-averse. If a squad of GIs ran into German resistance, a sniper in a farmhouse or a machine gun in a hedgerow, they rarely charged. They didn't try to be heroes. Instead, they went to ground. They took cover. And they waited. To the German defender, peering over his sights, this looked like cowardice. He would wait for the attack, finger on the trigger, adrenaline pumping. But the attack wouldn't come. Instead, he would see the American radio man speak into his handset. Minutes later, the world would explode. The Americans wouldn't send 10 men to take the farmhouse. They would send 50 artillery shells to erase the farmhouse from the map. Or they would call in a tank bulldozer to bury the defenders alive. Or they would summon AP-47 Thunderbolt to drop a 500-pound bomb on a single foxhole. One captured German officer famously complained to his interrogators, "You Americans are not soldiers. You do not fight. You just call for the artillery." This was the essence of the rich man's war. The United States treated high explosives as cheap and human life as expensive. Germany, running out of resources but still full of fanatical ideology, did the opposite. They spent men because they couldn't afford shells. The Americans spent shells because they valued their men. German soldiers realized that the average GI wasn't a warrior in the Prussian sense. He was a citizen in uniform. He didn't hate the Germans. He didn't particularly love the war. He wanted to do his job, survive, and go home to his family and his Ford. This lack of fanaticism made him cautious, but it also made him smart. He didn't take unnecessary risks. However, the Germans learned that there were exceptions to this rule. There were certain Americans they feared deeply. While they mocked the regular infantry divisions, the Germans held a terrified respect for the American elites, the Rangers and the Airborne. When German units encountered the 82nd or the 101st Airborne, the devils in baggy pants, the dynamic changed. These Americans did charge. They fought with a ferocity that matched the SS. In the brutal, close-quarters fighting of the Ardennes forests or the ruined cities, the German paratroopers, Fallschirmjäger, recognized the American paratroopers as kindred spirits. They were aggressive, lethal, and refused to surrender. But for the most part, the war in the West was a war of systems. The German soldier felt like a gladiator trying to fight a factory. There was a profound sense of unfairness in the German ranks. They felt they were the better soldiers, better trained, more disciplined, tougher. Man for man, they believed they could beat the Americans any day of the week. But they never got to fight man for man. They were fighting a style of war that felt industrial. The American soldier was more like a technician, operating a vast machine of destruction. He didn't need to be a better shot than the German. He just needed to know the coordinates. By the time the Allies reached the German border, the Wehrmacht's contempt had turned into a grim resignation. They knew that no matter how bravely they fought, they couldn't defeat an enemy who solved every tactical problem with an avalanche of TNT. The rich man was buying victory, and the price was being paid in German lives. In the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was not just dying. It was being torn in half. And in those final, chaotic weeks, the German army, once the most disciplined force in history, dissolved into a desperate mob with a single objective: run west. For the German soldier, the war had simplified into a binary choice. To the east lay the Red Army, burning with a desire for vengeance for the atrocities of Stalingrad and Leningrad. Surrender to the Soviets meant the Gulag, forced labor in Siberia, and likely death. To the west lay the Americans. The German soldiers called it the Golden Captivity. A grim joke circulated through the retreating columns. If you see a white plane, it's American. If you see a black plane, it's British. If you see no planes, it's the Luftwaffe. And if you see your own grave, it's the Russians. Entire divisions disobeyed orders to hold the line against the Soviets. Instead, they turned their backs on the Red Army and sprinted toward the American lines, desperate to throw down their rifles at the feet of a GI. They knew that American captivity offered something the East did not: a chance to live. When the surrender finally came, the interaction between the conqueror and the conquered was a massive culture shock. For the first time, the average German soldier and civilian stood face to face with the gangsters Goebbels had warned them about. What they found confused them deeply. The German military mind was built on hierarchy, stiffness, and rigid formality. An officer was a god. A private was a machine. But the Americans, they looked like a disorganized rabble. German POWs were stunned to see American privates leaning against walls, hands in their pockets, helmets tilted back, chewing gum relentlessly. They watched in horror as enlisted men spoke to their officers with casual familiarity, sometimes not even saluting. To a Prussian mind, this was anarchy. They couldn't understand how this sloppy, unmilitary mob had defeated the Wehrmacht. One German general, surrendering to an American general, famously remarked on the lack of discipline he saw. The American replied, "We don't salute with our arms. We salute with our results." But the Golden Captivity lived up to its name. The Americans didn't bring vengeance. They brought commerce. The American GI was walking proof of the success of democracy and capitalism. While Europe was starving, the Americans seemed to have endless supplies of everything. They had pockets full of Lucky Strike cigarettes, nylon stockings, soap, and coffee. The relationship quickly shifted from enemy to curiosity. The non-fraternization rules, orders forbidding Americans from talking to Germans, collapsed almost immediately. The GIs, many of them just lonely teenagers from Iowa or New York, couldn't bring themselves to hate the ragged, defeated people they found. German children, who had been taught to fear the American monsters, soon learned a different truth. The Americans were the ones with the chocolate. The image of the GI handing out Hershey bars became the defining symbol of the occupation. A German woman wrote in her diary in May 1945, "We were told they would rape and kill. Instead, they gave us soup and played jazz music. They are loud. They have no manners. They chew gum like cows, but they are kind." This was the final, crushing realization for the German people. They had been told they were the master race, destined to rule the world. Yet here were the victors, a mix of races, backgrounds, and religions, who were healthier, wealthier, and happier than the Germans had ever been under Hitler. The American soldier wasn't the warrior god the Germans had idolized. He was something more dangerous to the Nazi ideology. He was a free man. In the end, the German opinion of the American. In the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was not just dying. It was being torn in half. And in those final, chaotic weeks, the German army, once the most disciplined force in history, dissolved into a desperate mob with a single objective: run west. For the German soldier, the war had simplified into a binary choice. To the east lay the Red Army, burning with a desire for vengeance for the atrocities of Stalingrad and Leningrad. Surrender to the Soviets meant the Gulag, forced labor in Siberia, and likely death.